Translate this. The billionaire said with a grin that drew quiet laughter from every corner of the private dining room. Unless, of course, you only know how to carry plates. The words landed with the polished weight of expensive confidence, drifting through the crystal chandeliers, the soft piano melodies, and the gentle clink of fine china inside one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Conversation slowed. A few executives exchanged knowing smiles. Others looked away, pretending they hadn't heard a thing. It was the kind of room where billion-dollar partnerships were born over handcrafted wine and carefully rehearsed charm, where reputations were measured as carefully as stock prices, and where the people serving dinner were expected to remain invisible. Standing only a few feet away was Naomi Brooks, a young black waitress wearing a neatly pressed uniform, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't defend herself. She simply held the leather folder the billionaire had slid across the table as though it were no heavier than the dessert menus she had carried all evening. Across from her sat Ethan Caldwell, the 39-year-old founder and CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, a technology empire that had transformed artificial intelligence into one of the most profitable businesses in America. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Business magazines called him a visionary. Ethan preferred a different title. He liked being the smartest person in every room he entered, and tonight's private negotiation with a Russian manufacturing consortium was supposed to prove exactly that. For the past hour, he had impressed his guests with effortless confidence, dropping foreign phrases into conversations, referencing international markets from Moscow to Dubai, smiling each time another executive nodded in admiration. Then he noticed Naomi quietly refilling glasses without interrupting a single sentence. To Ethan, she became an opportunity, not a person. A harmless audience for one final display of superiority. The folder he handed her contained several pages written entirely in Russian. His guests recognized the language immediately. One executive smirked before whispering something under his breath. Another leaned back with folded arms, already anticipating the awkward silence that was surely about to follow. Ethan's smile widened. He wasn't asking for help. He was setting a trap. Around the table, polished cufflinks reflected the warm candlelight, while city lights shimmered through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Outside, yellow taxis crawled through evening traffic like tiny streams of gold. Inside, every heartbeat seemed to grow louder than the piano. Naomi looked down at the document without the slightest sign of panic. Her fingertips rested gently against the paper as though she were remembering something rather than reading it for the first time. No one noticed the almost invisible breath she took before lifting her eyes again. They only saw a waitress standing before a room full of powerful strangers. They never imagined they were seconds away from discovering that the quietest person in the room understood far more than anyone sitting at that table. No one at the table knew Naomi Brooks by name. To the guests, she was simply another server moving gracefully between polished walnut tables, replacing water glasses before anyone noticed they were empty, and clearing silverware with the kind of quiet precision that disappears into the background. That was the strange thing about places built on status. The more expensive the room became, the less people noticed those who kept it running. Naomi had learned that lesson during her very first week at Hawthorne House nearly 3 years earlier. Since then, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible without ever sacrificing her dignity. Every evening she arrived 45 minutes before her shift, tying her hair neatly behind her head, smoothing every wrinkle from her uniform, and checking every table twice because excellence, she believed, was something you practiced even when nobody applauded it. Most of her co-workers admired her calmness. Some wondered why someone so intelligent stayed in hospitality instead of finding a corporate job. Naomi always answered with the same gentle smile and the same simple sentence. Everyone has a season. Mine just looks different. What they never realized was that every tip she earned helped pay for her mother's medical treatments and the small apartment they shared in Upper Manhattan. Dreams could wait. Family could not. Across the dining room, Ethan Caldwell represented a completely different version of success. His custom navy suit fit perfectly. His watch cost more than many families earned in a year. Every word he spoke carried the confidence of someone accustomed to hearing agreement before he finished a sentence. Investors leaned toward him whenever he spoke. Executives laughed a little louder at his jokes than they actually deserved. Years of extraordinary success had quietly convinced Ethan that talent always announced itself through titles, wealth, and influence. He respected achievement, but only when it arrived wearing an expensive suit. As the Russian delegation continued reviewing financial projections, the atmosphere remained polished on the surface, yet beneath every courteous smile sat an invisible competition. Hundreds of millions of dollars depended on tonight's conversation. Every phrase mattered. Every document mattered. Every translation mattered. Ethan believed he controlled every variable in the room. He had spent weeks preparing presentations, memorizing market statistics, and rehearsing negotiation strategies with his legal team. What he had never prepared for was the possibility that the most important person in the room might be carrying a serving tray instead of a briefcase. Naomi still held the Russian document exactly where Ethan had placed it before her. The room remained unusually quiet. Even the piano player in the corner seemed softer now, allowing the silence around the table to grow heavier with each passing second. One executive glanced toward his phone before looking back up. Another exchanged an amused expression with a colleague, convinced they were about to witness an embarrassing moment that would become tomorrow's favorite story around the office. Ethan rested comfortably against his chair, folded his hands, and waited with patient satisfaction. He believed the silence belonged to him. He believed the room was watching Naomi. In reality, without realizing it, every eye had already begun watching him. Naomi lowered her eyes to the first page, allowing the silence to linger just long enough for everyone else to become uncomfortable. She did not rush because truly understanding a document had never been about reading quickly. It was about reading carefully. Her eyes moved across every line with calm precision, while the elegant script of the Russian language unfolded naturally in her mind, as familiar as the bedtime stories her father had once read aloud across the small kitchen table of their apartment years before. The expensive dining room slowly transformed into something unusual. Moments earlier it had been filled with quiet confidence and polished conversation. Now it was held together by expectation alone. Every executive leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Even the Russian guests watched Naomi with growing curiosity rather than amusement. They expected hesitation. They expected embarrassment. Instead, they saw complete composure. Ethan Caldwell noticed it as well, although he interpreted it differently. He assumed she was pretending to understand, hoping to avoid public humiliation for a few extra seconds. Confidence had taught him that silence usually belonged to the strongest person in the room, and he still believed that person was himself. One of his senior vice presidents glanced toward him with a grin that quietly asked whether they should end the joke before it became awkward. Ethan answered with the slightest shake of his head. Let it continue. He wanted everyone to witness the lesson. Across the polished table, the lead representative from the Russian delegation folded his hands without speaking. His expression remained unreadable, yet his attention never left Naomi. Unlike the others, he was not waiting for failure. He was studying details, the relaxed shoulders, the steady breathing, the way her eyes paused naturally at technical terminology instead of struggling through unfamiliar vocabulary. Something about her posture reminded him of experienced interpreters who understood that language was more than words. It was culture, rhythm, and intention. Naomi gently turned the page. The sound of paper brushing against paper echoed softly through the room. She continued reading without lifting her head, occasionally tracing a paragraph with one finger before moving to the next section. The legal terminology did not intimidate her. The financial language did not confuse her. Every sentence fit together with remarkable clarity. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of white and amber lights, while streams of traffic crossed the avenues below like glowing rivers. Inside, nobody reached for another sip of wine. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody interrupted the silence. For the first time that evening, the billion-dollar negotiation no longer revolved around stock valuations or manufacturing contracts. It revolved around one woman standing quietly beside the table. Naomi finally closed the folder with gentle care and rested both hands upon it. She lifted her eyes, not with pride or defiance, but with the calm confidence of someone preparing to answer an ordinary question. Before she spoke a single word, the lead Russian executive's expression changed almost imperceptibly. His eyebrows rose just enough to suggest recognition. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough to signal that something extraordinary had already happened long before anyone else in the room realized it. Naomi met the room with quiet confidence and began speaking in fluent Russian, her pronunciation natural, her pacing effortless, and her tone respectful enough that the representatives from Moscow instinctively turned their full attention toward her before she had even finished the first paragraph. The executives sitting beside Ethan Caldwell stopped smiling. One by one, expressions of amusement dissolved into confusion as they realized they could no longer predict what would happen next. Naomi did not merely translate individual sentences. She conveyed the meaning behind them, explaining subtle business terminology, legal nuances, and cultural expressions that could never be understood through literal translation alone. Every phrase sounded as though she had spent years living inside the language instead of simply studying it. The lead Russian representative nodded almost immediately. Another executive quietly corrected a handwritten note after hearing Naomi's interpretation, recognizing that the original English summary prepared for the meeting had missed several important distinctions. Ethan remained motionless. His confident smile faded so gradually that even he did not notice it disappearing. He had expected hesitation, perhaps an apology, maybe an embarrassed laugh before someone else stepped in to rescue the situation. Instead, he found himself listening with the same concentration as everyone else. The room no longer belonged to the man seated at the head of the table. It belonged to the woman standing beside it. Naomi continued calmly, translating a section involving manufacturing rights and long-term licensing agreements. Then she paused for the first time. Her eyes returned to one specific paragraph near the bottom of the page. She read it again silently before looking toward the Russian delegation with professional courtesy. In flawless Russian, she politely asked whether the wording reflected their latest revision from the previous week because the clause appeared inconsistent with the earlier draft. The question surprised every member of the delegation. The lead representative blinked before exchanging quick glances with his legal advisor. After a brief discussion in Russian, both of them nodded almost simultaneously. Naomi had noticed something that no one else in the room had mentioned. She returned to English with remarkable composure. There appears to be a discrepancy between the licensing provision on this page and the updated language referenced in the supporting memorandum. If this version is signed tonight without clarification, both parties may interpret future royalty calculations differently. Silence followed. Not nervous silence. Astonished silence. One attorney reached for the document and began comparing the pages. Another executive leaned closer, reading the numbers with growing concern. Within moments, the legal advisor from the Russian delegation quietly confirmed Naomi's observation. The translated briefing distributed earlier that afternoon had overlooked a revised provision that affected future revenue sharing. It was not dramatic. It was not sensational. It was simply important enough to influence a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan looked down at the contract resting before him, then back at Naomi. For the first time that evening, he saw more than a waitress holding a document. He saw someone whose knowledge had just protected a negotiation he believed he controlled. Around the table, respect replaced curiosity. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. The only sound left inside the elegant dining room was the soft hum of the city beyond the windows and the quiet realization that genuine expertise never asks permission before revealing itself. The atmosphere inside Hawthorne House changed in ways that no interior designer or orchestra ever could. Just minutes earlier, prestige had been measured by expensive watches, polished resumes, and commanding voices. Now respect was being quietly redirected toward the woman who had entered the evening carrying nothing more than a serving tray. Ethan Caldwell slowly leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the edge of the table as though shortening the distance between himself and the document might somehow restore the certainty he had lost. He had spent years believing intelligence announced itself with credentials, executive titles, and private offices overlooking city skylines. Naomi Brooks had challenged that belief without raising her voice once. The attorneys from both sides began reviewing every page again, this time far more carefully than before. Numbers that had seemed settled only moments earlier were checked a second time. Footnotes received fresh attention. Cross-references were verified line by line. The Russian delegation remained remarkably composed, Yet there was an unmistakable warmth in the way they now looked toward Naomi. She had not simply translated their language. She had respected its meaning. In international business, that difference was everything. The lead representative finally smiled before speaking in Russian once more. Naomi listened carefully, then answered with the same effortless fluency that had transformed the evening. A brief exchange followed, calm and professional, ending with several appreciative nods around the table. She turned back to English with the same measured tone she had used from the beginning. They appreciate that everyone is taking the time to confirm the revised language before moving forward. They believe careful partnerships last longer than rushed agreements. The sentence was simple, yet it carried unexpected weight. One investor quietly placed his pen on the table and let out a slow breath. Another executive, who had laughed earlier, lowered his eyes, suddenly far more interested in the contract than in anyone else's reaction. Nobody could remember the last time an entire boardroom had been humbled so gently. Ethan finally broke the silence. His voice remained calm, but it no longer carried the effortless certainty that had defined him all evening. "Miss Brooks, where did you learn Russian?" Naomi answered without hesitation or drama. "My father believed every language opened a door to another way of understanding people. He taught literature at a community college before he passed away. We spoke Russian at home because he wanted me to appreciate ideas before assumptions. Then I continued studying on my own whenever I could." Her answer lasted less than half a minute, yet it explained more about her character than any resume ever could. She did not mention sacrifice. She did not mention long nights after double shifts or textbooks borrowed from public libraries. She simply stated the truth and allowed it to stand on its own. Ethan found himself looking at Naomi differently than he had only 20 minutes before. Not because she had embarrassed him, but because she had reminded him of something success had quietly erased from his thinking. Extraordinary ability does not always arrive through the front entrance wearing an executive badge. Sometimes it enters unnoticed, carrying a water pitcher, waiting patiently for the moment when character speaks louder than status. Around the table, the negotiation resumed, but the balance inside the room had changed forever, and everyone present understood that the most valuable lesson of the evening had never been written inside the contract at all. The revised contract was printed again before anyone reached for a signature. What had been scheduled as a routine closing dinner quietly transformed into a workshop of patience, precision, and unexpected humility. Lawyers from both sides compared every paragraph with the latest revisions while assistants hurried between the conference room and the business lounge carrying updated copies. No one complained about the delay anymore. In fact, the atmosphere felt lighter than before because uncertainty had been replaced with confidence. Ethan Caldwell watched the process unfold with unusual stillness. Throughout his career, he had solved complex engineering problems, negotiated acquisitions across 3 continents, and delivered keynote speeches to packed auditoriums. Yet this simple evening had exposed a blind spot he had never recognized. He had evaluated people by the position they occupied instead of the knowledge they carried. The realization settled quietly, not as embarrassment alone, but as an invitation to become someone wiser than he had been when the night began. Naomi stepped back once the translations were complete, expecting to return to her regular responsibilities. She reached for an empty water pitcher, prepared to continue serving the remaining tables as though nothing remarkable had happened. That decision surprised everyone watching. She did not linger for compliments. She did not wait for applause. She simply resumed doing her job with the same professionalism she had demonstrated before anyone knew what she was capable of. The lead Russian executive stood from his chair before she could leave. Speaking first in Russian and then repeating himself in careful English, he thanked her for preserving the clarity of a partnership both companies had spent months building. He explained that accurate translation was not merely about vocabulary. It reflected trust. When language was handled carelessly, relationships weakened. When language was treated with respect, partnerships became stronger. Several executives nodded in agreement, recognizing that the evening had become memorable for reasons none of them had anticipated. Ethan rose as well. This time, every eye in the room followed him for a different reason. He walked around the long conference table until he stood only a few feet from Naomi. His voice remained composed, but it carried none of the theatrical confidence that had filled the room earlier. Instead, it carried sincerity. He admitted that he had underestimated her because he assumed he already understood who belonged at a business table and who did not. He thanked her for protecting an agreement that could have created years of confusion had the discrepancy gone unnoticed. Naomi accepted his words with a gracious smile. She neither celebrated nor criticized him. She simply replied that everyone has something valuable to contribute when they are given the opportunity to be heard. The sentence lingered long after she finished speaking. Around the table, several executives quietly reflected on their own assumptions. One investor made a note in his planner. Another introduced himself to Naomi before leaving, thanking her personally for the lesson he would remember far longer than any financial presentation. Outside, the Manhattan skyline continued glowing beneath the evening sky, unchanged by what had happened inside. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the conversation, the city somehow looked different, because they now understood that the brightest light in any room does not always come from the person seated at the head of the table. Sometimes it comes from the person everyone almost failed to notice. By the time the final signatures were placed on the revised agreement, the evening no longer felt like an ordinary business dinner. The polished conference room had become a place where assumptions quietly surrendered to truth. The legal teams exchanged satisfied handshakes. The Russian delegation spoke with renewed confidence about the partnership, and conversations that had once centered on quarterly projections gradually shifted towards something much rarer in corporate life: genuine respect. Naomi Brooks returned to arranging glassware near the service station as though the evening had unfolded exactly as she expected. She moved with the same quiet rhythm that had carried her through countless shifts before this one. Every plate was aligned with care. Every table was restored with precision. She did not behave like someone who had just changed the outcome of a negotiation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She behaved like someone who believed excellence was a habit rather than a performance. Ethan Caldwell watched her from across the room. It occurred to him that while everyone else spent years trying to be noticed, Naomi had spent years becoming exceptional without demanding recognition. That realization stayed with him far longer than any presentation he had delivered or any award displayed in his office. Before the guests prepared to leave, the lead Russian executive approached Naomi once more. This time he carried a small hardcover book that had been resting inside his briefcase throughout the meeting. It was a collection of classic Russian literature printed in both Russian and English. Opening the cover, he wrote a brief handwritten note before presenting it to her with a warm smile. He explained that language had the power to build bridges between people who might otherwise remain strangers, and tonight she had reminded everyone in the room of that simple truth. Naomi accepted the gift with sincere gratitude, holding it carefully as though it represented something far more valuable than its pages. Several executives nearby quietly applauded, not because anyone requested it, but because appreciation felt like the only appropriate response. Ethan stepped forward one final time. Instead of speaking as the chief executive of a global company, he spoke simply as another person who had learned an important lesson. He admitted that he had entered the evening believing leadership meant always having the right answers. Naomi had shown him that real leadership also required the humility to recognize wisdom wherever it appeared. He thanked her not only for protecting the agreement, but for reminding everyone that dignity should never depend upon a person's job title. Naomi answered with the same calm grace that had defined her throughout the evening. She said that every person enters a room carrying experiences others cannot see, and the safest assumption is that everyone has something worth teaching if someone is willing to listen. Those words settled over the room with remarkable quietness. Nobody hurried toward the elevators. Nobody reached immediately for a phone. For a brief moment, every executive stood still, reflecting on conversations they had forgotten to have and people they may have overlooked along the way. Outside, Manhattan continued shining beneath the night sky, its towers reaching confidently above the streets below. Yet inside Hawthorne House, another kind of skyline had emerged, one built not from steel and glass but from character, humility, and the quiet strength of a woman whose greatest qualification had never been written on a business card. The dinner concluded nearly an hour later, but the conversation refused to end with the final handshake. As guests slowly filtered through the grand lobby beneath warm chandeliers and polished marble arches, they carried more than briefcases and signed agreements. They carried a story they knew they would repeat for years. One executive quietly admitted that he had nearly joined the laughter when Ethan first handed Naomi the Russian document. Another confessed that he had never once wondered whether the people serving dinner possessed talents far beyond the roles they performed each evening. The lesson lingered because it had arrived without anger, without humiliation, and without anyone demanding recognition. It had simply revealed itself through quiet excellence. Ethan Caldwell remained inside the private dining room after everyone else had begun leaving. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched the lights of Manhattan shimmer across the river, each reflection reminding him that perspective changed everything depending on where someone stood. Success had taught him how to build companies, negotiate investments, and recognize profitable opportunities. Yet tonight another lesson had quietly rewritten something much deeper. Character could not be measured by income. Intelligence could not be identified by clothing. Wisdom did not always sit in the most expensive chair. He turned toward the nearly empty room, where staff members carefully restored every table for tomorrow's guests. Naomi was once again arranging silverware with the same attention she had shown before the evening changed forever. Nothing about her demeanor suggested she believed she deserved special treatment. She smiled politely at coworkers, thanked the kitchen staff as they finished cleaning, and placed the bilingual book carefully inside her tote bag before returning to her responsibilities. Ethan walked over one final time, carrying a business card from his jacket pocket. He offered it to Naomi, explaining that if she ever wanted to explore opportunities in international communications, cultural consulting, or corporate negotiations, his door would remain open. Naomi accepted the card graciously, but her answer reflected the same quiet confidence that had guided every decision she made throughout the night. She told him she appreciated the offer and would think carefully about her future, but she also believed every opportunity should be accepted for the right reason rather than the most impressive title. Ethan nodded with genuine understanding. For perhaps the first time in many years, he realized he was speaking with someone who did not measure success by proximity to power. As Naomi prepared to leave for the evening, several members of the restaurant staff gathered near the entrance. They had heard pieces of what happened inside the private dining room, but none of them knew every detail. They simply congratulated her with warm smiles, proud that someone who had quietly worked beside them had reminded an entire room of executives that dignity belonged to everyone. Naomi thanked them with characteristic humility and stepped outside into the cool New York evening. Yellow taxis rolled past beneath glowing streetlights while the familiar sounds of the city surrounded her. It looked like every other night in Manhattan, yet something invisible had changed. Somewhere above the skyline, billion-dollar decisions had been protected because one overlooked waitress refused to underestimate the value of everything she had spent years learning. And somewhere inside one of the city's most powerful business leaders, respect had replaced assumption, proving that the most meaningful transformations often begin with a single conversation and one person who chooses knowledge over pride. Several months passed, and the story from that evening quietly traveled farther than anyone expected. It was never announced in a press release, never promoted through a marketing campaign, and never transformed into a headline by either company. Instead, it spread the old-fashioned way, through conversations between business leaders, attorneys, interpreters, and executives who had been present that night. Whenever someone described the agreement that nearly went in the wrong direction, they rarely began by talking about financial projections or international strategy. They always began with the quiet waitress who had seen what everyone else overlooked. Ethan Caldwell discovered that the evening had changed more than a single negotiation. Inside Caldwell Dynamics, he introduced a simple practice during executive recruiting. Candidates would no longer be judged only by prestigious universities, famous employers, or polished presentations. They would also be evaluated for curiosity, humility, and the ability to recognize talent in unexpected places. During one leadership meeting, he shared a lesson without mentioning names. He told his executives that the most expensive mistake any organization could make was assuming they already knew who mattered before someone had the opportunity to speak. The room fell silent because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Naomi Brooks continued working at Hawthorne House for several more months, while carefully considering the opportunities that had gradually appeared after that remarkable evening. She accepted occasional consulting work involving multilingual business communications, But she never abandoned the values that had shaped her life. She still visited her mother every evening after work. She still borrowed books from the public library. She still believed that learning was not something people completed after graduation, but something they practiced every day. The bilingual volume given to her by the Russian delegation remained on the small bookshelf beside her dining table. Inside its cover, the handwritten message became a daily reminder that knowledge carried its greatest value when shared with kindness. One rainy evening, Ethan happened to visit Hawthorne House again for another business dinner. This time, before sitting down, he greeted every member of the restaurant staff by looking directly into their eyes and thanking them for their work. When Naomi approached the table, there was no awkwardness between them, only mutual respect. Ethan smiled warmly and asked how her mother was doing. Naomi smiled back and said she was improving, one day at a time. Sometimes the greatest evidence that a person has changed is not found in dramatic speeches or grand gestures. It is found in the small choices repeated every ordinary day. As the lights of Manhattan reflected across the wet streets outside, the restaurant looked much as it always had. Guests talked over dinner. Servers carried trays with quiet professionalism. Music floated gently through the room. Yet hidden within those familiar moments remained a truth that everyone from that extraordinary evening would carry for the rest of their lives. Power can open doors, wealth can fill boardrooms, and titles can command attention. But none of those things can replace humility, character, or the willingness to see value in another human being before the world tells you to. That night was never truly about a billionaire or a waitress. It was about a choice. One person chose arrogance, then learned humility. Another chose excellence without seeking recognition. And in the end, the most fluent language spoken in that room was not Russian at all. It was respect, understood equally by every person who was finally willing to listen.